I'm Jane Alexander, Nantucket Book Festival alumna, welcoming you to At Home with Authors.
On this episode of At Home with Authors, introducing a young musician and poet whose legacy captures the tragedy of the era of Vietnam.
I'm going far away from you. Leave my job.
In 1968, Michael O'Donnell volunteered for the U.S. Army.
I've got my orders for Vietnam now, but I won't be going over till 18 November, 68. So it's still a long ways off.
About a year later, during a lull, in between his dangerous missions transporting and rescuing U.S. troops, O'Donnell wrote a poem, pivotal in this story, read here for us by a veteran of the Iraq War, author Kevin Powers.
Letters from Pleiku. If you are able, save for them a place inside of you, and save one backward glance when you are leaving for the places they can no longer go. Be not ashamed to say you love them, though you may or may not have always. Take what they have left and what they have taught you with their dying, and keep it with your own. And in that time when men decide and feel safe to call the war insane, take one moment to embrace those gentle heroes you left behind. Captain Michael O'Donnell, New Year's Day, 1970.
I know more for you.
After stumbling upon that poem, our guest, Daniel Weiss, now CEO of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, made room in his life for a detour to bring Michael O'Donnell's story to life. On this episode of At Home with Authors, Daniel Weiss joins us to discuss his new book, In That Time, Michael O'Donnell and the Tragic Era of Vietnam. Joining us, too, is the book's publisher, Peter Osnos, who at the time Michael O'Donnell wrote Letters from Pleiku was a journalist with the Washington Post, reporting from Vietnam and Cambodia. I'm going to start with Daniel to at least give the audience that has not read this book yet a little background on the book, and then we're going to take it from there.
Sure. Well, thanks again. I'm delighted to be here. So the book project really began for me quite a long time ago, probably 15 years ago, when I first encountered one of Michael O'Donnell's poems. Michael, who is the subject of this book, was a young man, helicopter pilot, and he wrote poetry while he was in Vietnam. And one of those poems was published in Harold Evans' book called The American Century, which outlines really the political and social history of the United States in the 20th century. And near the back of that book, there is a section on Vietnam. And within that section, there was a small photograph of this young man and a poem that he had written. And that photo and that poem were by Michael O'Donnell. And I read the poem, and I was very moved by the sentiment, by what it evoked about the time in our history. And there was something very powerful about the poem, the last stanza of which says, "And in that time, when men decide and feel safe, call the war insane. Don't forget those gentle heroes you left behind." And shortly after he wrote that poem, his helicopter was shot down, and he was left behind, missing in action for nearly 30 years. So at the time I encountered the poem, I wanted to learn more. And one thing led to another, eventually resulting in this book.
And I just want to pause for 1 second, because there's one line in your book, and it's really a lesson to aspiring authors all over the place. You said this did not begin as a book project, but rather as an act of curiosity.
Yes, it was. I wasn't sure where it would lead, but I was intensely interested in knowing more about this young man, understanding his story and the context which led him to this very, very tragic moment in our history and in his own life. And one thing, as it were, as these things happen, led to another, and eventually it became clear to me it was a book I wanted to write.
And then it was a book you wanted to write. At what point, Peter Osnos, did you two come together?
Well, I am the founder of Public Affairs Books, which is a New York-based publishing company, now part of the Hachette Book Group. And this proposal from someone who I did not know arrived on my desk in a very ordinary, over-the-transom way from an agent. And I started to read it, and I said, wow, this is impressive. This is really going to be a very interesting book. And who the hell is this Weiss fellow? And then I discovered his pedigree, and I thought to myself, well, now that's something. Why is Dan Weiss, the chief executive of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, taking on the subject of a young GI shot down in 1970, body not recovered for 30 years? This is the story I would like to know more about. So as you said, in Dan's case, it was curiosity. In mine, it was also curiosity. What I like to say is that the agent, in a sense, almost found a needle in a haystack. Not an agent I knew, but she found one of the few people in New York old enough and experienced enough on Vietnam to be riveted by the prospect of this book. And so I acquired it as the editor and publisher, and that's how we began to work together.
And by the way, as an editor and publisher who acquires books, and some are hits and some are misses, do you just have a gut instinct? Do you do market research? You know, what is it that makes it, that puts it over the tipping point?
For me, it's certainly not marketing research. It's, do I want to know more? And do I want to do it? My entire, as Dan now knows, my entire publishing career has been built around books I want to do, not books I need to do. And so far that has worked.
For me, when I met Peter, and because of his background and his knowledge about the subject and his genuine interest in this project, it really made it possible for me to write this book. He was in many ways the ideal audience, at least in the sense that he had a perspective and an interest in the subject. Of course, he knew a lot about it, having covered it for the Washington Post. But it made it possible for me to invest the time and energy it took to write the book, because I had Peter waiting for me to deliver it. And he became a really important colleague and friend in the process. With a different kind of publishing arrangement, the book would have been different. The outcome would have been different, I'm sure.
I want you to take us into really the harrowing scene of the battle and what Michael O'Donnell's mission was and the outcome of that battle, because it was really breathtaking and probably, well, unique in some ways in terms of the level of heroism, but not unprecedented.
Sure. The book is organized such that the pivoting moment, the center of the story, is really what happened on that day on March 26, 1970. And O'Donnell was a helicopter pilot flying very dangerous missions in the northern highlands, the central highlands of Vietnam, flying into Cambodia and Laos. This was in March of 1970, before we were authorized, the American military was authorized to be in those places. So he was basically flying commandos secretly into these places to do reconnaissance and report back to the military leadership. He had been in Vietnam for about 6 months at the time. He had never fired a shot. He did not operate a helicopter that was engaged in attack. He was mostly transporting soldiers into battle and rescuing them and bringing back casualties. On this day, he was called to join a team to rescue a group of commandos who were under duress being chased by the North Vietnamese in the mountainous region of Cambodia, just adjacent to the border of Vietnam. And they were told this would be a very dangerous rescue, that these guys on the ground had very little time left. There's a very complicated process of conducting a rescue mission for commandos on the ground under such circumstances. And it involves about 7 or 8 helicopters, 2 or 3 fixed-wing aircraft, all operating in a choreographed way to protect each other and to save the soldiers on the ground. They all flew into formation above this 1,000 feet, 1,500 feet above the action in Cambodia, waiting for these commandos who were absolutely running through the jungle, being traced by the enemy. And the situation was deteriorating very rapidly. So O'Donnell was one of a group.
And by the way, if I can interrupt, these American commandos who had infiltrated secretly, as they would for reconnaissance, what was their way of communicating to the rescue team?
So the commandos on the ground were always in radio contact with a fixed-wing pilot who was flying a slow airplane way up in the sky, and they were in constant communication with this commander to tell them their situation. And at a certain point, they had been they were really being chased by the enemy around the clock for about a day and a half, when they realized that this was not going to, they had to get out immediately or they were likely to die. So they radioed up to the fixed-wing pilot saying, we need to be rescued right away, we're running for our lives. And it was the fixed-wing pilot, the forward air commander, who then, as it were, scrambled the rescue team, the helicopters and others, to come into place to conduct this complicated rescue mission. So the helicopters were all on site, along with the fixed-wing aircraft. Some of the helicopters had weapons in order to attack various areas on the ground to protect the commandos. Yes, fighting a war where you could never find the enemy, you could never see them. They didn't occupy, the rules about territory did not obtain in Vietnam. Napalm was a very brutal way of finding the enemy by dropping this chemical into jungles where they must be somewhere. And this is what happened during the day that Michael was trying to rescue them. They dropped napalm to try to separate the enemy from the commandos. The irony is, whereas it did do that, the napalm also, it ignited the forest and the jungle. And then as they were running, they were being chased by the flames that their own warships had created. So one problem led to another problem. And many of those things were not contemplated at the time. And at a certain point, the leader of the mission, a guy named Jim Lake, who was a friend of Michael O'Donnell's, a colleague of his, he decided that the group had to go back to the base to refuel because they were waiting too long and they would not be able to stay on site. So as a matter of just covering the area, he said to O'Donnell, you stay here in your helicopter and monitor the situation, along with 2 helicopter gunships. So everyone else went back. It would take them about 15 minutes to get to the base. It would take them a few minutes to fuel up, and then about 15 minutes back. So in about 40 minutes or so, they expected they would be back on site to conduct the rescue, especially since the commandos were still not in the rescue area. They were still running through the jungle. As O'Donnell hovered in this place on his own, the commandos actually realized they were not yet at the rescue spot, but they were about to be overrun by the enemy. And they radioed up to the fixed-wing commander that they were not going to survive if they were not rescued right away. So Michael O'Donnell made the decision on his own that he will go down by himself with his crew in his own helicopter and conduct the rescue mission.
And so pause there for a moment, because literally a delay of minutes might have made this rescue impossible. That's how close the enemy was.
The enemy was close. All of this was almost cinematically choreographed for drama, and the timing was really remarkable. So he's hovering at 1,500 feet, waiting for Jim Lake and his colleagues to come back from refueling, monitoring the situation down below. And he realizes that if he doesn't make this decision to rescue these guys right now, they won't survive. And whatever the reasons one went to fight in Vietnam or to be in Vietnam, every helicopter pilot, every single one, had the same mission. And it was, under any circumstance and under any risk, you rescue your friends on the ground. That's what you do. So at the time he realized that these commandos were in dire straits, he radioed to the forward commander and to Jim Lake, who could hear him coming back. They're coming back from the base. They're 10 minutes away. They're all talking to each other on radio. That he said, they need to be rescued. I'm going down right now. So he went down by himself through the jungle canopy, very carefully maneuvering his helicopter in very treacherous space, surrounded by the enemy. And he set down the helicopter on an area of ground. And then he waited 4 minutes on the ground for these commandos to get there. Under enemy fire for 4 minutes in that situation is as exposed as you can be. But he waited. And the commandos arrived, they got on the helicopter, and he began to climb up out of the canopy once again. And as he cleared the trees and he began to see that he had made this rescue and he was successful, by this time Jim Lake and the others had actually arrived back on site. So they're all these other helicopters are hovering in the sky watching this dramatic moment. And as O'Donnell cleared the trees, he said, I've got them all, I'm coming out. And he started to accelerate forward and climb. And at that moment, the helicopter was hit by a missile from the hillside below. And he was moving forward fairly quickly, so the helicopter continued moving forward for another 100 or 200 yards before it then plummeted beneath the jungle canopy, and there was a burst of flames and smoke. So Jim Lake and the others all watched this happen before their eyes. They did not know the circumstances. They didn't know if their friends were killed or not. So one of the helicopters went down very quickly to try to do a fly-through and see what could be discovered. And they were being fired at constantly. So then Lake, the commander, took his helicopter down to try to take a look, and he too was fired at, and realized that if he didn't clear the site and the others didn't clear the site, then none of them would survive. And so as he said to me when I interviewed him 45 years after the fact, it was the most fateful decision he ever made in his life. He said to the rest of all the crews up there in these helicopters, let's clear the site and go back to base. There's nothing more we can do here. So they all flew away and saw the burning helicopter, the remains of the helicopter on the ground. At the time Jim Lake made that decision, that fateful decision, he was 19 years old. This is what that war thrust upon young people. And they went back to the base. And because of the nature of this kind of mission and where the crash took place, no one ever went back. No one ever looked for him. That was the end of it. He was left behind.
At this point, Peter Osnos, just given your background and your reporting background, what are you thinking as you hear this story?
Well, the truth is that Dan said something one day that made an immense impression on me. He said, I've chosen this particular young man, this young soldier, to be the focus of my book. But in fact, you could really write 50,000 books. Because every one of those soldiers, and they were at that time, the ones in the field were all men, they went to a war that they were very young, 19, 20, 21, 22. They did not know or could not possibly understand the true nature of the mission. Defeat the communists in Vietnam, hold back the tide of the Red Chinese spread through. They just went to the war because that was what they were expected to do or told to do. And so what you had here was a situation in which hundreds of thousands, remember, hundreds of thousands. The war in Vietnam was much, much, much bigger than the wars that have been going on in Afghanistan and Iraq for almost 20 years now. At this peak, we had 500,000 troops there in Vietnam, plus the troops that were based in the 7th Fleet and the Air Force surrounding countries. So it was a huge enterprise, and a great many people were dying. It was also something that, because of the draft, the country was much more acutely sensitized to than they have been for the wars of for this century, 21st century. It was very much part of our lives. It was the first living room war. It was the first war where you could watch the battles as they took place because there were cameras there, and it wasn't a newsreel. It was not quite real time, but almost. So you had this extraordinary sense of a war that was being fought far, far away by a great many young people that no one really understood or could define. I think the defining characteristic of our experience in Vietnam was ignorance. We didn't know the country. We didn't know the people. We didn't know their history. We, Americans, thinking we were people of goodwill, were going in to protect the country from the takeover by communists. Completely in historical retrospect, an absurd notion. And but that was the war. That was an imperial war. That was a war in a sense, at the peak of America's sense of imperial requirement. And that's why all of these fellows who gave their lives, we all can understand why, when you look back on it, you say, what the hell was that about?
And it's ignorance of another culture and another politics, another country's politics. And at the same time, here we are 50 years later. And for those of us, I and I think, Dan, it sounds like you just missed growing up with the living room war. It was just a few years before we were really sitting there watching the news. And so for many of us, being introduced to Michael O'Donnell is in some ways, unless we had family members and we heard stories, our first introduction to the people behind the numbers.
I think that's exactly right. And I too was just young enough to miss the Vietnam War, but I remember its ubiquity in the media every single day. Just that was the story. It washed over our lives in all kinds of ways. But when I was writing this book, I wanted really to explore what it means to experience the kind of loss that Michael O'Donnell's family and other families experienced. And the best way to do that, I thought, was to really present this individual as a fully alive individual, as a person who had a life, who loved his life as much as we love ours. There was no destiny. He didn't know he was going to die. He's not a statistic. He was a person. And so I wanted to kind of unburden us of the statistics of the war and just get to know this one person. And if we can feel something about him and his life and his loss and the loss of those who loved him, then we know a little bit more. We come just a little bit closer to understanding the nature of sacrifice in circumstances like this. It's one thing to have a loved one die in a war that is a cause people would call noble or important or defensive, like the Second World War obviously is a good example. But to die in service of a mediocre or poorly thought through political idea for no good reason is, I think, especially painful. So I really wanted to try to tell Michael's story in that way, to connect the readers to what it means to lose someone in war.
On that subject, I actually was just on my pad drawing out sort of like a constellation of people that you introduced us to, you know, with Michael O'Donnell at the center. And I was saying, boy, I got to know literally dozens to some degree or another of people who I never would have known. I never would have known about their roles, from the 8 men who were running for their lives and had that feeling momentarily of being rescued. Who are they? To the Jim Lake, who all these years later, at the age of, I guess, right around 70, still doesn't forgive himself. To Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, because you've given us some of the political context. To his sister. Tell us about Michael O'Donnell's sister, who took on the burden of a brother being listed as missing in action for some time and then wanting to really get to the bottom of it.
So Michael's sister was 2 years older than her brother. And at the time he was shot down, she was finishing college and was about to go off on the Peace Corps to have her own international adventure. Her parents were both living, able-bodied at the time. And when Michael went into the war, of course, her parents would not have her go abroad to a dangerous situation. One child was enough for that. So right from the start, Patsy, her name, was her life really became in many ways supportive of her brothers. So she didn't go into the Peace Corps, and she went on with her work and her life. And then a few years later, when Michael was shot down, she found herself unsatisfied by being a passive recipient of government news whenever the government felt that they had something to communicate. Her brother was missing in action somewhere in Vietnam. They had been told very, very little. They received a telegram, and then a few days later, a second telegram, both of which said very little except that your child has been shot down while engaged in conflict, and this is a confidential matter. We'll share the information with you as we have it, but don't tell anyone about it, as though somehow that was an important part of the message to them. Patsy decided to do what she could to learn more. So she went and reached out to people she knew in government, and she spent the next several decades engaged in a very, very frustrating quest to learn more about her brother. And in the meantime, both of her parents left the scene. Her father died in 1986, I believe, and her mother shortly thereafter got Alzheimer's and effectively didn't recognize her children. So Patsy was left alone carrying the burden of her brother's legacy for many, many years, for 30 years, until the story continued when the crash site was actually located in 1998. And I got to know Patsy when I began this project, and we've become very close friends, and I learned something about what it means to be the sibling or family member of someone missing in action. It is an excruciatingly difficult experience to have.
And so we have Patsy, who we really got to know well. Where there's so many other people, I have to just tell people, please read in that time. I think it took me, really, I read it in a day because I got hooked on it. But it's not a long read, but there is so many aspects of it. But because of who you are, the author, And because you run the Metropolitan Museum of Art, I just thought, before our interview, I sort of went through and took a virtual tour again. I've spent a lot of time over the years at the Metropolitan Museum, and two things occurred to me. There is a still photo in your book that I could see being in a glass case in some room in the Metropolitan Museum. And it's that photo with, was it 8 dog tags laid out and some of the artifacts, and I guess that's the right word to use, or objects that were recovered from, by the way, another man we meet in your book who I wouldn't have even known that there was such a position, Dr. C.E. Moore, who was the sort of forensic archaeologist who has been doing this for a life. And it's worth you telling us about this archaeological dig in the forests of Cambodia to find the evidence, not just of the helicopter, but of the bodies.
So by the mid-1980s, after the war ends for us in 1973, and it's lost in 1975, 10 years later, the American people began to demand greater accountability about what happened in Vietnam. And as a result of that, there were various initiatives to begin trying to find whether there were POWs, there were certainly missing servicemen who had been killed. And the government put together a task force to do that, a whole agency of the government to do that. And in 1998, when there was evidence that the crash site was located in the jungles of Cambodia, this archaeologist, this anthropologist, C.E. Moore, he led the group. This is what he did for a living. He was a PhD scientist, and his job was to go on these very dangerous archaeological missions to find the remains of American servicemen. When asked why he did that, he said that it's because I want to do my part to honor these servicemen. And so he did this. When he went for this particular recovery effort, which was extremely difficult, in the middle of nowhere, I mean absolutely nowhere, 50 kilometers away from the nearest small village, they had to hike. They spent, 5 or 6 days hiking and floating on bamboo rafts just to get to the crash site. Then they had to establish a crash site, an area where they could bring in some helicopters. And he describes quite meticulously what that recovery effort was like. And it is both very exciting, but also extraordinarily dangerous to do what they did. But the most remarkable thing is to relocate human remains, or to recover, rather, human remains from a tropical jungle more than 30 years after the person was killed in a fiery crash is a remarkably difficult thing to do. And so I try to describe in the book how meticulous that effort was to try to locate a single bone fragment or a tooth from a jungle, hundreds of miles of jungle, is a remarkable thing. But this is what the American military did in the 1980s and 90s, and they continue to do. And they did find the crash site, and they did find the remains. And eventually, Patsy, Michael's sister, received the word that her brother's remains finally had been found and identified. But that took over 30 years.
I was really struck by the archaeological grids that you describe in order to cover as much ground as possible and not miss, as you say, not miss even a tooth if it was there.
So it's just to imagine for a moment what this is like. They find the helicopter, and the helicopter, by the way, is so covered in foliage and so decayed that if you're 25 yards away from it, you wouldn't see it. Once they found this helicopter, then they had to clear the entire area. So for a very large space all around the helicopter, they had to completely remove all the foliage from this tropical jungle, completely remove it. Then they had to excavate into the ground, about a foot, maybe a little bit more into the ground, to try to sift all the dirt to identify, to find whether there are bone fragments, because human remains do not stay above ground. The only ones that are found are below ground. And so they had to basically turn the earth inside out in order to find the fragments of these missing servicemen. And it's a remarkable story, but they, as I say, they were successful in finding them.
And so now let's move forward. And I want to move forward into Cambodia because I guess, Michael O'Donnell lost his life on March 24th, 1970. Was it, let me see, April 30th, was that 1971 that Nixon announces the invasion of Cambodia? Peter, help me with that.
No, it's 70.
It was 70. I'm sorry.
There was a coup in Cambodia in March, in which Prince Sihanouk, who had kind of kept the country technically out of the war and was a kind of colorful neutral, he was overthrown and replaced by a group of generals. And that, at the time, simply was a trigger for a conflict in which the United States in the spring invaded into the parts of Cambodia next to Vietnam, ostensibly to get rid of the North Vietnamese troops who were in there. But what it did was it set off a flame for a war inside Cambodia, in which it turned out to be, in the end, pretty much a civil war between two Cambodian groups, the Khmer Rouge, brutal, unbelievably brutal communists, and these, and the residue of the old Cambodian regime, Cambodian troops. The United States itself did not fight the Civil War. The United States precipitated, in nearly every respect, a war that followed. And what's astonishing when we consider what happened, that we lost lives in Cambodia, but the Cambodians at the end lost millions of lives. The United States went home, leaving behind the mess in Cambodia, which led to a genocide. Over 2 million Cambodians were killed by the Khmer Rouge. And in the end, this was the classic description of Cambodia was a sideshow. Yes, Michael O'Donnell died there. Americans were there, but that wasn't really our war. Our war was Vietnam. Our war was the war in Vietnam, which was supposed to stop the spread of Chinese communism. And in a sense, these two wars, and then there was also one in Laos, they were all going on at the same time, and no one, almost literally no one, could tell you really what was really going on, because it was so complicated, so confusing, and Americans really were oblivious to the full extent of what was going on.
And so looking at the whole war, just for a moment, through the lens of the Michael O'Donnell story, to me really brings home the tragedy of it, because here was O'Donnell, learning this from In That Time, your book. Here was O'Donnell running these high-risk missions, and all his fellow helicopter pilots into Cambodia to rescue teams or to bring in teams who were seeking intelligence for the day when that war against Cambodia may very well come. 5 weeks after his death, just 5 weeks, Nixon announces the invasion of Cambodia, as you put it, a sideshow. All for a sideshow. It's heartbreaking.
Almost everything that these soldiers fought, these pilots engaged in the war, they realized that what they were doing was, for the most part, politically and militarily pointless, and that they were going to be dying and being injured and be devastated in various ways for absolutely no point. So you can imagine how excruciating that is, to be a group of soldiers in the middle of nowhere in the central highlands of Vietnam, just trying to get through each day and stay alive, when you knew your own people, your own government, was putting you at risk to die for no reason, no productive reason. That's the greatest tragedy here, I think.
Let me just add something about the challenge of, I wouldn't call it the publishing challenge, but the challenge of writing a book like this now. This is 2020, the book was published last fall, 2019, the end of 2019. 50 years basically after the fact. I was very much aware as we were publishing the book that for most of the people who I was, as a publisher, presenting the book to, the war was a distant past. When I asked a room of 150 people at the Hachette Sales Conference, how many of you in this room served in any capacity in Vietnam between 1965 and 1975? And I was the only person in the room. They were all too young. How many of you were eligible for the draft? Only 2 people out of the 150 were even eligible for the draft. No one served. The truth is, the war, as Dan described it, was 50 years before the moment in which the book was published. And 50 years before the 1969-1970 period was 1920. And when you stop and think about how much we relate to events 50 years before the fact, you can see the challenge here. Vietnam was a war we could see. And yes, there have been movies and there are books and so on. But for most people today, the overwhelming majority of people today, Vietnam is a distant memory, something that they have maybe read or seen a little bit about. But Dan gives it a kind of tangible effect, a tangible understanding of what it literally, if you were a 20-year-old kid in 1967, 68, confronted with the issue of whether to go and serve. You know, at the moment, we're all talking a great deal about first responders and all the people on the front line, all of those things which are real and very powerful at the moment. Well, the soldiers who served in Vietnam and all the support people who served in Vietnam, they were there for some form of protection of who knows what. And that's really, I think, the tragedy that is there. Lives were lost. People now talk a lot about World War I. What was the meaning of World War I? Why was the United States involved in World War I? It's a great mystery still, all these years later. And the answer in Vietnam, I think, has created a conundrum that we can, to this day, can't really appreciate. And Dan's book makes it real because there's a human, a person, someone we can relate to, who, by the way, if you look at his picture on the cover, he could have been any kid today in Wisconsin. He was a musician. He sang songs that today kids still listen to. So I think that there's, in a sense, a magnificent relationship between what Dan has done with this book and the degree to which Americans in 2020 really have the most kind of opaque sense of what Vietnam really meant.
The other thing I would add, though, as we think about the fullness of time in the 50 years that have ensued since Michael O'Donnell was shot down and killed, is to reflect on the fact that this August, Michael O'Donnell would have turned 75. And so he's 3 years younger than Joe Biden, who's getting ready to run for president. And those 50 years, that's how one might measure in part what it means to lose your life as a young person. His life was taken from him. And everything that followed 1970 to the present moment was taken from him and all of the others who died. And I wanted somehow to think about that too, that life goes on, but not with them. And that's what it means to be left behind.
And if he had been alive today, I want to read you something. Peter and I had a brief email exchange because there was the Pentagon Papers that many of us who studied politics and history read in college. And it was such a blockbuster, the Pentagon Papers. Just in December, the Washington Post published the Afghanistan Papers, a thorough investigation of what our government officials knew and were not telling us about Afghanistan, and specifically the lies from administration to administration. And when I read those Afghanistan papers in the Washington Post, I wondered why the story didn't last for more than a day or so. And I asked Peter, based on his background, and he said, well, we were then, by today's standards, easier to shock and less cynical. So Michael O'Donnell would be in a world today that we are living in that is harder to shock and much more cynical. What does that trigger in your mind?
I think Peter's exactly right. As one reflects on one of the I think, major consequences of the 1960s, that era, is the complete disruption of our confidence in government and their ability to do what we would say is the right thing, or to be transparent and honest about it. So in rapid succession, we had the Vietnam debacle, we had the assassination of 3 major leaders in the late 1960s. We had the convention of 1968, the Democratic Convention. Then we had Watergate. And all that has followed those watershed events, I think, has led to the continued diminution of confidence in government. So I would ask our viewers, as a thought exercise, what bit of news could you imagine hearing that would actually surprise you about the government? That would actually surprise you? Because the Afghanistan Papers 25 years ago would have been a major story for months. But today it was a 2-day story, maybe, and no one really even paid attention. Because I think that level of cynicism, as Peter says, has become so profound that we are unsurprisable and undisappointable because we have seen it all. And this is not a good moment in our country, I would say.
Let me ask you this, because on that phrase, we have seen it all, as somebody who is an art historian, is there anything you can point us to in the history of art that might sharpen our lenses and help us understand this moment we are living to, whether it is the heightened cynicism or simply what we are dealing with now on a day-to-day basis, the coronavirus pandemic?
Well, I would say not so much the history of art, but the history of civilization. That I have the good fortune of working in one of the great art museums in the world, where I'm surrounded by 5,000 years of world civilization and history. And every one of the cultures that produce the objects that are in our museum were made at a time of great confidence or anxiety or powerful feeling, that people were living through their own experience in ways that they didn't have the full view of history that we have because of our relationship to the museum. And so I think if people are reminded of the fragility of the world in which they live, and that the institutions that we have built are not so resilient, that they are not subject to collapse or failure, and that if we walk through the Metropolitan Museum and we see that the Egyptian civilization lasted for almost 3 millennia, without major disruption, we are now at about 250 years in the American experiment. Is it likely that we will go another 2 to 3 millennia, given how things are going? I think that fullness of history, that understanding of the fragility of human civilization, might increase our respect for what it is that we've built so that we preserve it and pay more attention to it. That's a lesson I see in the Met when I walk through the galleries and I see what happened to the Roman Empire. That will never end. Well, it did. Egypt, it did. The Greeks, they did. And it's before us as Americans to ask what's next. As we come out of this virus, what kind of world do we want to build?
It makes me I want to take, right after this conversation, the virtual tour again of the different galleries, which are really presented fantastically online.
Thank you.
Can you point me into a room at the Met right now where not only can I get that sense of the fragility of our civilization, of our institutions, but maybe how institutions and societies at certain times became more resilient, at least during a period? What artifacts, what art is there that can maybe inspire me about the resilience of human beings?
One of the most beautiful spaces in the Metropolitan is the so-called Roman Court. It is a gallery that has its beautiful skylights, and there's a fountain in the middle of the space. And surrounding the gallery, there are great sculptures, primarily, and some mosaics that were made in the early years of the Roman Empire. So in the years just after the first few centuries of our era. And within that space, there is a portrait of one of the great leaders in the history of all mankind, Marcus Aurelius, who was in the 2nd century, the Roman emperor, who fought one war after another, trying to preserve the empire and protect the boundaries and the borders. But he is known to us and remembered for all time as the author of the Meditations, perhaps the most sensitive and thoughtful piece of writing ever done by a leader while in power. And what Marcus teaches us is that that resilience requires a certain kind of humility, a certain appreciation of the day-to-day benefits of being alive, regardless of whether you're an emperor or a peasant. And he does that with great wisdom and generosity of spirit in a way that book that he wrote, it's by my bedside. It's been by my bedside my whole adult life, and I'm not the only one. And his portrait is in the Roman Court, and it reminds me every time I walk through of how timeless those kinds of values are. Even if civilizations might come and go, those core human values endure.
Peter Osnos, I can't, I'm sort of speechless with that. And of course, the first thing I'm going to do is buy a copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditation.
Second thing you're going to do, the first thing you're going to do is tell people to buy a copy of In That Time.
Both of them together, and we'll put In That Time on top.
Okay.
Thank you.
What do you think, Peter, in terms of?
What Dan is it's one of the reasons why I found the book so compelling. He has given us a fragment, a human fragment of a much greater story. The story is the story of civilization, in which we create these empires of power and strength and vision and innovation. And inside are all the things that eventually can take an empire down, because there are all those human instincts of greed and corruption and power, ego, and so on. I mean, the beauty of the Michael O'Donnell story, to me, among others, many, is that this is such a clear and pure example of what it means to be young, what it means to be gifted, in a way, what it means to be brave in a society that has other agendas. It has an agenda of power, it has an agenda of wealth and richness. And the great conflict in American society is that. And what we see now, and again, going back to this notion of how much pride we take in first responders. You know, when you were a GI in Vietnam and came home in 1970 and 71, nobody much paid attention to you, and a lot of people were hostile. How dare you go and fight in that war? Today, if a veteran comes into the room, somebody who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, I tell you, people stand up and clap the way they do for the first responders. We have an appreciation of humans, and yet we're in the midst of a society, a culture, a civilization that's endangered by its flaws. And I think that that is the great, in a sense, challenge, paradox of this moment. And what we've seen is the fragility of what we have, because we went from so-called the best economy in 50 years to something equal to the Great Depression in a heartbeat. The reason we're doing this online is precisely because everything changed and there was no way we could do it in person.
Daniel Weiss and Peter Osnos. Daniel Weiss, we are going to have a link which makes it very easy for people to purchase in that time. Michael O'Donnell and the tragic era in Vietnam, tragic era of Vietnam. Thank you for joining us on the Nantucket Book Festival's At Home with Authors. Peter Osnos, thank you so much for joining us and bringing this book to light. It's really been a treat.
Thank you so much. It's been a joy to be with you both.